Hi, I'm Christine McDonald from Rushing River Apiaries, and I am out at one of our wintering yards. You can see that it is still very snowy out here, although we are just having a really extended winter and a late start to spring. So even though there's still a ton of snow, today it's about 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It's one of our first opportunities to actually crack the lids on our hives, start to look at our winter survival, and then also get pollen patties on, because even though it still seems very wintry, the trees are going to start producing some pollen in the next week or two, and we try and beat it by 10 days to 2 weeks with our pollen supplement so that we're really boosting that spring brood production in order to sell nukes in a month or so. So I will show you a bit of what I find inside these hives. I'm also going to talk a little bit about some considerations for using pollen sub or pollen patties on your own hives. You can see how much snow there still is around our hives out here. It makes for tough walking, but it always amazes me how much the snow kind of melts out right around the hives so that the bees have access and a way out for cleansing flights. So I've already smoked these guys down off the top pretty good, but this is a good opportunity to see kind of where the bees are and how many frames they're on. So you can see that they're kind of filling in between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then a little less out here. And if I also peek right down in there, I can see lots of capped honey left down on the frames, and I can tell that without pulling any frames, which is nice this time of year because it's warm enough to crack the lid for a minute, but not warm enough yet to be pulling frames. Okay, I'll catch this one before I smoke it down. So we use these reflective bubble wrap underneath all of our inner covers, so the bees are right under this. You can see that a few of them get up in between the cover and the inner cover, but then when I peel this off, that's our first peek at the hive for the year. The bees have kind of broken cluster a little bit. That's different from even a couple days ago when I was peeking in hives at another yard. But they are looking strong. Love it. Okay, so we're going to open up this hive and check for viability, and then also throw some pollen on. This is just insulation. We're getting there now. There's still one more layer under here because we use this kind of shiny bubble wrap. And I'm going to smoke them down as we peel up here, peel from your side. So this hive is pretty small. I'll push that down so you can see. Pretty small. They're really just on like this half of the box. You never really know with 2 boxes whether there's more like down in the bottom box, but from the top, this one is small but viable. And because there's all this burr comb here, I'm just going to smoke the bees down and gently get rid of some of that. So that I can put these patties on and not worry about them fitting under the inner cover. Now, I'm going to put on, it's basically it's 2 halves that I have left over because this is a pretty small hive. If this was a booming hive, I would put 2 full patties on, but don't do that if you live in a place with small hive beetle. We're really lucky to not have to worry about small hive beetle. And so we can get away with leaving patty on longer. If you do have small hive beetle, you want to feed less more frequently and make sure that they're eating it all in between feedings. And that's going to go right back under this cover. Can see a little bit of poop from some dysentery over the winter, but they didn't have much right on the bars, which is good. Now, put our attic back on. So there's a few things that you want to consider if you're using pollen patties on your own hives. One of them, as I mentioned, is small hive beetle. If you live in a place where small hive beetle is a problem, then you want to feed small pieces of patty more frequently. Make sure that they're consuming all of it and that it's not being left in the hive, because it will invite small beetles and small hive beetles in. So just feed a half or even a quarter at a time, make sure it's consumed, and then add a little more. Because we don't live in a place with small hive beetle, we can put on 1 or 2 full patties and wait 2 or 3 weeks between feeding pollen in the spring. You also want to think about timing. Once you start feeding pollen sub, you can't stop. Otherwise, your bees are going to start to cannibalize the larvae because that's what they're using to feed the larvae. If they get ahead of themselves and they produce too many to feed because you've suddenly taken away that protein source, then they're going to start cannibalizing that brood. So to avoid that, once you start feeding pollen sub, you need to continue feeding pollen sub until your first big pollen flow is on. In our area, we get a really good pollen flow when the maples and willows are in bloom, so those earliest trees. Then we have a little bit of a lull, and we usually end up feeding some pollen sub again to get them through to when the dandelions are in bloom. And that's kind of the beginning of our real reliable nectar and pollen for the summer. Something else that you want to consider is that your bees are eating this. They're not storing it for later. So you're only giving it to them so that they can adequately feed the nurse bees, or the brood, so that those nurse bees can feed the brood that they are raising. And it's going to stimulate them to raise more brood because they have that abundance of food. If you don't want your hive to brood up really quickly because you're not planning on splitting and you're hoping to just kind of hang on during swarm season and get away without having to make a split, then you don't want to start feeding pollen sub early in the spring. It is going to cause a faster buildup, which is great if splits are in your plan, not so great if splits are not part of the plan. We'll also talk just briefly about the difference in different pollen patties that you can get. We use global patties, and there's kind of 2 options when you buy global patties. You can get 4% natural pollen, or you can get 15% natural pollen. But it's not really a matter of just more is better. Most of the nutrition and protein actually comes from the other ingredients that are used in the pollen patties, and the natural pollen is really just to make them want to eat it. So it kind of adds attractiveness. So they're going to consume a 15% pollen patty a lot faster than they're going to consume a 4%. That also means that because they're consuming it faster, you're going to need to feed more frequently, and they're going to brood up that much quicker. So again, think strategically about which kind of pollen patty you are choosing when you're adding it. The other really important distinction to make, especially if you're a new beekeeper, is that pollen patties and fondant or sugar or honey are completely different things. They fill completely different nutritional needs. Fondant and sugar replace honey. Those are just carbohydrates. They don't get any other nutrition from those supplements or really from honey. All of their nutrition comes from pollen or pollen supplements, and they need both in order for a colony to thrive. Right now, our hives still have lots of honey in them. I can see that when I look down in the hive, so we're only feeding pollen. If I was worried about the amount of food in a hive, then I would be feeding fondant or sugar to get them through till spring. And I might do that in addition to pollen, or I might not, depending on what my goals are for that hive for the year.